Afternoon. I'm Ben Eikey, Manager of State Training and Development at the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne State University. The Levin Center is located at Wayne State University Law School and is dedicated to bipartisan fact-finding and legislative oversight and investigations. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's panel discussion titled "The Eyes of the People: How Statehouse Journalism Affects Legislative Behavior." Thank you for joining us. Today's panel is part of the Levin Center's launch of our brand new State Oversight Academy, or as we affectionately call it, SOA, or SOA. All week, the State Oversight Academy is rolling out new tools and programs designed to elevate state legislative oversight. So what is SOA? The State Oversight Academy is the first and only national institution dedicated to oversight by state legislatures as essential to good governance and democracy. To learn more about SOA and its programming, go to stateoversight.org, our website, which has a wealth of information about the State Oversight Academy. You can also sign up for our newsletter to stay informed about our activities. I want to thank our distinguished panelists for being here today to talk about their approach to journalism and coverage of state capitals and the role that state oversight plays in the work they do. Co-moderating with me today is Professor Adam Zelizer. Adam studies legislative politics with a focus on causal inference. His research examines how legislators make decisions, for example, how they acquire expertise from policy research and influence one another through deliberation, and the effects of individual decision-making processes on policy outcomes. One goal of his research is to figure out the legislative processes that work in the sense of leading to more informed, effective, and broadly supported public policies. Professor Zelizer, really excited to have you co-moderating with us today. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Jonathan Oosting, a state government and politics reporter for Bridge, Michigan. He works to inform the public and hold elected leaders accountable. For his reporting on fallout from the 2020 presidential election and exposing homegrown extremism, Jonathan was named the 2021 Journalist of the Year by the Michigan Press Association. He previously covered the state capitol for the Detroit News and MLive. He's from Grand Rapids and now lives and works in Lansing. Next, Amelia Knisely is an investigative reporter in West Virginia, where her writing on the state's child welfare system, hunger, and poverty won national awards. Amelia returned home to West Virginia in 2019 through the Report for America program to cover poverty for the Charleston Gazette-Mail. She went on to work at Mountain State Spotlight, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. While there, Amelia and reporter Molly Bourne were nominated for a Livingston Award, which recognizes the best journalism in the country for young reporters, in 2022 for their work investigating the state's foster care system. She also regularly writes about the intersection of legislation and public health. Thank you for being here. Camryn Sanchez is the state Senate reporter for the Arizona Capital Times in Phoenix and covers all political issues involving the chamber. Camryn also reported for the Yonkers Times in Yonkers, New York in 2020 and spent a summer with the Arizona Republic as a Pulliam Fellow covering Phoenix in 2021. Camryn is currently a member of the Arizona Press Club, moderates legislative debates for the Citizens Clean Elections Commission, and participates in roundtable discussions about state politics on PBS. Thank you for being here. Now, I'll let turn it back over to Adam.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Levin Center for having us all. I'm going to turn this over to the reporters very quickly. I promise they are the stars of the show. But as preparation for the first question, I want to point out what I think is so interesting and useful about this panel. The question about media's role in a democracy is not a new one. For at least 100 years, academics, public intellectuals, and journalists themselves have highlighted the benefits and costs of having a political system where people are informed by mass media. those debates typically focus on voters, on the public, on the people who are reading newspapers or watching television. And those questions are fairly well understood. We're here today to think about the targets of the journalism, the subjects, the people being written about, and how media influences their behavior. So a focus on elected officials, bureaucrats, and other government officials, and what role journalists have in keeping them honest, observing and reporting their behavior, and maybe influencing their behavior. So with that introduction, I'll start with the first question, which is to ask each of you how you think the decline in local journalism affects state-level politics. I am a professor, so I'm happy to call on someone if there are no volunteers. Camryn, please.
I think it's a bit of a leading question for us because, I mean, I assume we're all going to say that it's a bad thing. And I do believe that. I think that, you know, having reporters at the local level is important for coverage in general, is important for democracy. You know, the smaller the pool of reporters at the legislative level, the more that slips through the cracks, because all eyes are, of course, on the president or the US legislature, but then there's fewer of us covering the state legislatures or even little city council dramas. And, you know, sometimes those things end up being bigger stories, but no one catches them early on.
Yeah, I would echo that I think actually that's probably a phenomenon more pronounced at the city council level, as Camryn said. I've been covering the state capitol in Michigan for about 10 years now, and I'd say actually that steady decline has sort of started to reverse itself. I think when I first started, we'd sort of hit rock bottom in the number of Capitol reporters in Michigan. But over the last few years, slowly those numbers are inching back up. I mean, it's nowhere near the level of, Capitol Press Bureau as we saw, 20, 30 years ago. But some of the newspapers here have added a second or a third Capitol reporter in recent years. And there's new publications too, operating in different spaces. So I worked for a nonprofit news site called Bridge, Michigan. We existed a decade ago, but we were very small. We had just started and we're growing, and we have 3 full-time Capitol reporters now. So I think that trend is slowly starting to hopefully reverse itself in the long term. But I see here in Michigan anyways that it's the real local governments that aren't getting the attention. I previously worked for MLive, as you noted, and MLive runs a series of newspapers across the state, the Grand Rapids Press and the Flint Journal being a couple of the bigger ones. But some of those local newsrooms have really been hollowed out over the years. And there are parts of the state where there are no local newspapers operating, at least no daily local newspapers operating anymore. So, some wild things happen in those local governments. I think we saw that a little bit through the pandemic when suddenly everybody was streaming their local government meetings, and I from Lansing could check in on what was going on at a small town city council meeting up in the UP, and sometimes it was pretty shocking because I think those folks had not been accustomed to having any media attention or any accountability from the press as a result.
So just to follow up, the people who were yelling and screaming were the elected officials, not the people who showed up for public comment?
Sometimes it was both, Traverse City is not exactly a small town in Michigan, but there was a city councilman a county commissioner in Grand Traverse County who flashed a gun during a Zoom meeting, for instance. He was, at his house, I believe, not in a chamber, but still that sort of behavior that you just, probably doesn't, might happen at these local meetings, these infighting, small-time drama between commissioners and council members that most folks would probably never be aware of if it weren't for that rare opportunity we had when suddenly everything was online.
So I want to follow up on that with a question. I think Amelia would be a great person to talk to this question, which is what kind of behaviors by elected officials, by government employees, do you think that the media maybe has been missing or prevents by, just virtue of being there and covering stories? So, Camryn said, we think it's a bad thing that there's less local media. What kind of behaviors do you think are allowed to go to, or do you observe running freely when there is a lack of media accountability?
I feel like in West Virginia, because we are one of the poorest states in the country, there's a huge disconnect between reality and what happens in the State House. And I'm sure other reporters would say that too. But in our case, bills are made in a vacuum. We have a Republican super majority, and not to say that that none of them have connections to poverty, but we see a lot of bureaucratic bills, like adding hurdles to getting emergency food assistance, adding hurdles to getting unemployment. And the way they talk about the system is so far from reality. And in our case, in West Virginia, we have one of the lowest amounts of people who have cars. We don't have public transportation in most of our cities. It's not like there's a lot of citizens at the Capitol as well, or lobbyists even. But it really is crucial for the press in our state to bridge that gap between what's really happening, particularly on our coal fields, and what people are voting on. And sometimes not even nonprofits are sharing that information accurately, right? So, because they're trying to sometimes get money and they have to say certain things to do that or leave certain things out. And so that's what I see, is that I just feel like a lot of bills can be so far from the reality of how people in poverty are existing.
So just to highlight one, I think one interesting part of your answer, you think that state legislators, for example, don't get this information about the lives of voters unless there are reporters covering it, writing about the bills and how they would affect ordinary people so that the legislators can read it and see it.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for every single one, but I've definitely seen that. And I think also, sadly, sometimes bills are based on misinformation, right? So I think it's something that I see a lot, just because there are a lot of bills that end up impacting people who are in poverty, who have virtually no access to the Capitol.
Does anyone have experience with legislators reading your stories or contacting you to ask for more information about some issue that they would then legislate on? Can you share those stories, Camryn?
Yeah, all the time. The Capital Times is the paper that I work for. We have a House reporter who's dedicated to the House and a Senate reporter, that's me, who's dedicated to the Senate. So we're literally there every day, writing about the goings on. And I know that our lawmakers and also lobbyists, consultants, other politicos keep track of our stuff, because sometimes we hear something important in a committee hearing or whatever, and we have such a broad network of sources. And so I know I was writing about the budget negotiations recently, because that's what we're doing right now. And I was talking to, I think it was the chair of the finance committee, and I was like asking him a bunch of stuff about the budget. And he looked at me and he was like, honestly, the stuff I know about the budget right now is from reading your article last week. So stop asking me. And I was like, okay, that's fair. But yeah, and I think that's a good thing. I appreciate the fact that the lawmakers are engaged, even though it's a little stressful, because I get a lot of texts about, you could have used more quotes from me or whatever. I'm like, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. People like to be portrayed in a certain light. That's not always possible.
Yeah, and I think obviously, if you do really deep, impactful journalism, you hope that lawmakers read it and start developing policy solutions as a result. But there's also like some well-known lawmakers in Michigan, I won't name names, but who anytime they see a story on TV have a bill to introduce the next day because they want to be on TV talking about that issue. So there's some opportunism there as well, I think. But yeah, of course, when it happens, when lawmakers do actually read your work and start thinking about solutions, it's gratifying, and hopefully we can help them get outside of the Capitol bubble as well, which we need to do more of as reporters probably too.
I'll turn, pass off the microphone to Ben in a second, but I have one more follow-up. It sounds like you all are filling a hole in providing information and research to politicians that we might think they would be able to do through legislative institutions, through staff, through the governor's office, through the bureaucracy. But it sounds like the kind of information available to them may not be great, at least in all contexts. Do you think that's something that has changed? Do you think politicians seem more or less informed about important issues that you cover? They're relying on you more or less on some issues than others, more or less over time? I apologize if that question is a little abstract, but it's something I would be very interested to hear about. Yeah, Amelia.
I think here, some of our problems that we're legislating are fairly new. I mean, we have been in a drug crisis for several decades, but the last 10 years has completely destroyed our state. So that is why I've done a lot of writing on child welfare. We lead the nation, the highest number of kids the highest rate of kids coming into child welfare, right? Like little West Virginia. So I find that lawmakers have to spend a lot of time, right? Because you have new lawmakers coming in and out, getting caught up on really simple terms about foster care or drugs or Narcan. And so I think that's part of the issue is sometimes you're legislating things that are fairly new issues and there aren't immediately available sources, at least in my part of the state. So.
Interesting. Camryn, I thought you also wanted.
Well, I think this might be a good time to note that I'm not perfect. I won't speak for everyone else, but there are certainly things that I don't get. So in as much as my role is to make sure that things don't slip through the cracks and that I'm informing others, I also get informed by others and I rely a lot on people who know more than me. In my ideal article, I would have every voice that is affected by every piece of legislation. And of course, that's not realistic either. So it's difficult for not just lawmakers, but also for reporters to get every possible necessary angle. I mean, we've got hundreds and hundreds, at least 1,500 bills this session just in Arizona. So there's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, as to your broader question, Adam, about lawmakers and whether they're more or less informed seemingly these days. I think it's hard to paint with a broad brush, right? There are some lawmakers who you learn pretty quickly are very serious, do their research. Often they're committee chairs, folks who, have an interest going in or develop one in a specific policy area. But there are other folks who are, more politically minded than policy minded and are just trying to jump on the latest trend, whether it's, trans athlete legislation or something like that, or drag show legislation, without really, studying who that would impact or how big of an issue it really is. It just makes for a good headline. So, I think it's hard to say. There's a, uniformity there. It really varies. Yeah.
Thanks. Ben, do you want to take over question for a minute?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I have one thing that I'm giving some thought to with what Jonathan's been talking about and also what Amelia has been mentioning, the thought about poverty and the idea that, those that have the most to lose when a government program or service might not be operating as intended seem to also have sort of the least amount of ways to be able to kind of sound that siren and say, hey, I this system is not working for me. I'm trying to apply for unemployment and I can't seem to get anybody on the phone, or I don't really know where to be able to go to be able to get access to, things like emergency food assistance. Have any of you thought about, because the chairs, John, like what you brought up, and thinking about their own priorities, have there been ways to be able to think about bridging that gap where you have sort of more marginalized populations and being able to get those stories, those, kind of shared actual experiences to the attention of committee chairs in your state legislatures across the states? And if so, has that been effective? Is there a way to do that through journalism that could be kind of pointed to as a best practice?
Yeah, I mean, solutions-based journalism, or I mean, I think, right, like I'm a Capitol reporter, and I try and get out of the Capitol bubble, but I think some of the most impactful journalism that lawmakers actually need to read happens outside of the Capitol bubble, right? I do get opportunity for issue-based stories sometimes to travel around the state and talk to folks more, but simply covering the legislative mechanics or the process, doesn't necessarily lead to sort of reporting that actually, lawmakers need to read. That said, I mean, I've always, noted just as far as the institution itself, I've always said, man, there really needs to be a lobbyist for like regular people in Lansing, because you have all these special interest groups who, I mean, committee meetings are generally, anyone's invited to testify, but it's about organizing people to actually show up and speak to lawmakers. And there are lobbying organizations or associations that are very good at doing that, and getting their perspective in front of lawmakers. But there's not anybody typically lobbying for just like average folks. I mean, there are some groups, of course, that lobby for or represent, lower income people on certain policy issues. But I think there needs to be more of that. Journalism plays a role, but, advocacy groups as well have an ability to actually, get people transported to the state capitol, so that they can be in front of lawmakers and make their voices heard.
Yeah, Camryn.
I would also credit grassroots here in Phoenix. It's the largest city and it's the capital. There's a lot of grassroots organizations here. People showing up in public comment who are affected by a bill is fairly common. And I think, for me as a journalist, it's important to quote those people. But in terms of bringing them to my lawmakers, I think it's important that we're not the activists. And I want to make sure that I'm not doing the advocacy. So it's more about me quoting them and then the lawmaker reading the article that has the quotes in it versus me being like, hey, here's how you should be doing this. Here's what would be a great idea, because, I can't do that. The transgender is at the top of my mind because Jonathan mentioned it. So we had a bill that banned female students K-12 from being on, trans female students from being on girls' teams. And I managed to track down a parent and I just talked to the kids straight up, and I gave her an article just talking about the law because she'd been looking forward to school sports and was just getting ready to try out, and because the bill passed wasn't able to. So I didn't set up a meeting with the family and the lawmaker, but I let the article happen.
And just serving as a communication entity at that point. Yeah. So the next question I kind of have here, I was just kind of curious to get a little bit of, just some lived experiences from all of you. Can you discuss any experiences you've had when legislators and government officials have changed their behavior when they knew media was covering their actions, whether on the floor or in a committee meeting or when releasing a report? I'm seeing nodding heads. Who would like to take it first?
I'll just note, I mean, I've shown up to events like lawmakers doing in-district things or forums in the community, and they see me in the crowd and they make it a point to say my name out loud so that not only they acknowledge me, but that everyone knows that a reporter is here. So yeah, I mean, you definitely see that. It's good to make people uncomfortable once in a while. You got to do that by showing up to things.
Camryn?
I was going to say showboating. When the cameras are on, especially when the TV people come and they have the big fancy cameras, then I think there's a little bit of, sitting up straighter and using speeches and posturing, and, that's understandable. Honestly, if I were a lawmaker, I'd probably do the same thing.
Human nature.
But
Sure.
I think definitely behavior changes when you're being watched, and there's definitely meetings behind closed doors that journalists are excluded from. And I think sometimes that's necessary, but, I know for a fact that the behavior changes dramatically.
Amelia?
I echo all that. I just, we have a certain agency here that will just openly say, we're not going to talk about that. There are reporters in the room. So, I mean, that happens more than I'd like for it to. So very used to that.
Have any of you, as a follow-up to this question, I'm thinking about it, like the context of a hearing, do you notice a change? And it's probably tough when you're not in the room to compare when you are in the room, but I would be curious to know if they prioritize certain questions that they think are going to be, you know, really catchy in front of a camera, or are going to be super quotable for a magazine article or whatever it might be. Have you noticed a change in just what questions are prioritized if there's media in the room?
Sorry, I think it sort of depends on the hearing. I think lawmakers generally know when they are going to get a lot of attention at a hearing, right? And those are the ones that even at the state level sometimes feel more like a congressional hearing, in that they seem to be almost scripted. Everyone is given a good question to ask by staffers, et cetera. I mean, we saw that a lot in the pandemic, right? We're talking about oversight. I mean, the House Oversight Committee in particular is run by Republicans. We have a Democratic governor. There were some controversies over pandemic policies, and the people that ran that committee knew it, and they were very well prepared, not only with the experts that they invited to testify, but the questions they had in advance. And, you know, going back to my point about it seeming scripted, I mean, there were even, you know, before the hearing ended, there were, you know, press releases from the Michigan Republican Party saying, you know, the chairman is going to be talking about the explosive findings of the hearing that hasn't concluded yet immediately afterwards at this press conference. So, you know, I think you know, a lot of times lawmakers go in knowing if they're going to have sort of a real interesting topic or something of high interest, and that is going to get media attention. You know, other hearings sometimes, you know, not so much. And generally I try, you know, I mean, depends on the hearing, but sometimes I'll try and slip in the back to not be noticed. But, you know, Michigan does stream most of its hearings online right now and archives them in the legislature. So there's not a ton of opportunity for a public hearing to, like, you know, be totally ignored. So I think lawmakers go in with the assumption that they're pretty much going to be watched in some capacity, regardless.
Yeah.
So Ben, if you don't mind, I'm gonna jump in a little bit and follow up on that comment with this idea about transparency in the legislature. Something like 20 state legislatures exempt some part of their legislative process from open meetings laws, whether it's committee hearings, subcommittees, caucuses, party caucuses, floor debates in some cases, floor votes in some cases. Do you have experience with that in your state? How do these FOIA laws or freedom open meetings laws vary? How does that affect your reporting, and how do you think that influences the behavior of policymakers? Camryn.
I'm so glad that we got to this. Yes, in Arizona, we have live streams and most of the committees are recorded, but not all of them. Caucus and rules are not. Rules is where they talk about which laws are legal, and they have their rules attorney, who's a nonpartisan person, and his staff come and they say, oh, you know, this might be a constitutional challenge. That's never live streamed, so I always have to go in person and take notes, because there's never going to be a record of it, and it's not, you know, there's nothing there. And then caucus can be open or closed, and that's at the discretion of the party. So, you know, I'm texting the comms director. I'm like, hey, am I allowed to be in caucus today, or is it closed to me? And then I'm finding out the day of. And caucus is, you know, important because that's where the party, the Republican caucus or the Democratic caucus, discusses their position on various bills, which is often handy for me to know later on what, you know, so-and-so said, or where the opposition was. And then I assume we're going to talk about public records law more. I know this is not unique to Arizona, but the lawmakers here exempt themselves specifically from public records law. So there's laws for every other public officer, and then the legislature's laws for itself, which are a lot looser. So it says, you know, we had some changes this year, but we can delete text messages at any time, don't have to turn anything over, basically, in that vein. Emails can be deleted after just a few months, and security camera footage. And, you know, I've been really hitting a brick wall with public records requests. And I've found that, you know, some lawmakers just simply won't turn anything over. and there's no consequences for that. And then other people choose to turn things over. So I'm getting a very skewed response because, you know, I think that if I had the full picture, then it would be very different than just that one person who decided to give over that one email that was relevant to my request.
Yeah, Michigan has a similar set of laws as it pertains to open meetings of the state legislature, in that you know, committee hearings and floor votes are open for sure, but caucus meetings are never public, and legislators here, as well as the governor, are fully exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests. So, I mean, I think the result of that is the idea, like lawmakers will make a big point, like we're holding a committee hearing because we're doing this in a transparent fashion, but you know, it becomes evident at some of these that decisions have already been made in advance. And what is advertised as a transparent public hearing is, as I said before, sort of a scripted show to, you know, reflect the version of transparency that lawmakers actually want, or you know, so, you know, I understand the need to deliberate privately. I think it would be very hard to govern if you were completely in the public at all times. That said, I wish, you know, folks would just be a little more honest about it. You know, if you've made up your decision ahead of a public hearing, you know, don't pretend that it's anything but that. It becomes a farce at some point and delegitimizes actual transparency.
We have a Republican super majority in West Virginia. So we have 88 Republicans and 12 Democrats, and caucus is exempt from open meetings. So every committee meeting this year pretty much was Republicans meeting before and then emerging and like throwing an amendment down or something. And Democrats were trying to catch up, right? But what I saw happen more than once was if a Republican couldn't make it to the caucus, they would just vote for the bill anyway, because they'd be like, oh, it already went through caucus. And I had multiple times this year where I called a Republican trying to get more information on particularly education bills, and they didn't realize what they had voted for. So that, I mean, that's very concerning for multiple reasons, right? And one was even a teacher who had voted for a pretty substantial education bill. So I think it's been difficult. Not that, you know, I don't think that every reader needs to know every piece of how the sausage is made, but certainly parts of how it's made are really important to how the bill is going to affect and travel down the line. And having zero access to that, I mean, I have a few people on the inside who might tell me certain things, but those people are limited, makes it difficult to report on these really big bills that are going to be possibly transformative.
I want to follow up on that thought, but your comment, Amelia, brought to mind one of my favorite headlines from West Virginia in 2018. West Virginia lawmakers try to give teachers smaller raise, accidentally pass bill giving them full raise. Turned out pretty much everybody didn't know exactly which version of the bill they were voting on in that case. But you all mentioned how important party caucuses are and how many decisions take place there and how they are generally exempt from any type of open meetings requirement. But it also seems like you don't, well, let me ask you just straightforward. How good are your sources within the parties? Do state legislators talk about what goes on in these meetings? How much conflict is there? How good are your sources?
I mean, the general rule in Michigan from both parties is what happens in caucus stays in caucus. But, you know, that's issue by issue, right? If lawmakers want you to know something that happened, they know how to reach me and do occasionally. So just depends on the issue. You know, any leaks you get out of those are usually for a very strategic purpose by that lawmaker. So you got to be careful, you know, on how you use that information, because it could be an attempt to manipulate you as well.
I mean, I was on staff for 4 years in the Michigan legislature, and I never once went into a Republican caucus meeting. And so anything I ever heard about it was secondhand from either my boss or from other members of the caucus. It was sealed pretty shut.
I mean, that surprised me because I would think in Congress that would be a much leakier institution with information. It sounds like state legislatures, kind of these norms of party discipline seem to be quite strong, which is somewhat surprising, especially in a state like Michigan that has term limits. I think Arizona has some sort of term limits as well. Camryn can correct me if I'm wrong. So I would think that individual legislators would not have huge incentives to stay loyal, that they might be willing to step out of term, but it sounds like they really don't.
Yeah, it's pretty rare to Ben's point. I mean, I think the issue that lawmakers are wary of is that there generally is pretty swift reprisal from leadership. If you do, you can lose committee assignments. You can be kicked out of caucus. We've seen that with a few lawmakers here over the years, folks who are technically a member of one party or ran under one party's banner, but are no longer allowed in those meetings. So yeah, I think it's, I guess it depends on the particular leader in the House or Senate, but yeah, in my decade or so covering the legislature, it has been pretty tight-lipped for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would make the same point about retaliation. Like if you're talking to the media, then you're a snitch, you're a rhino. Rhino is a very common term here in Arizona. There's certainly a wing of the party in the House and Senate who make it a point to never talk to the media. It's like a point of pride. Sometimes when they see me in the room, they make a point to say, I'm talking to the fake news media in the room, print lies, which is always like, well, so, they won't want to be the leak. That's not a flattering thing for someone to be known as. And usually, like Jonathan said, it's a strategic reason. If someone's telling me something that happened behind closed doors, so-and-so was attacking such and such about, then you find out that the person leaking it to you was a co-signer on the bill or something. Like usually there's a reason.
Interesting. So I'll go ahead and bring up, I think, to kind of finish this conversation about open meetings and transparency, that there has been a little bit of work done lately by a couple of political scientists, Jeff Harden at Notre Dame and Justin Kirkland at Virginia. They have an article and a book. The book is called The Illusion of Accountability: Transparency and Representation in American Legislatures. And the main takeaway from that book is that the open meetings and legislative or at least government transparency that really spread through the states after Watergate really hasn't had much of an effect one way or the other. It really has not made our legislators more accountable to the public. It also hasn't really had what some people might think of negative consequences of reducing bipartisanship. It may have strengthened special interests a little bit, but that by and large, it seems to be kind of a promise unfulfilled. So it sounds like there's pretty strong support on this panel for transparency. Do you think that is a promise unfulfilled in some ways? And I think we've already heard maybe some ways in which it is. And what could be done to make legislators potentially more accountable?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge. I think, even in Michigan, where I said, for instance, the governor and legislature are both exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. Well, state departments are not. And we know that people in state departments can be very clever about avoiding the freedom of, communications that will be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. If you don't want to be public, don't put it in an email, just say it on the phone. You do see email threads where folks just say, let's take this communication offline, stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging problem that I think, true transparency is very difficult in politics because, people learn how to work around the system, regardless of what that system is. That said, I'd rather have more laws that at least try to encourage transparency than fewer, because there's more tools for me to use. I mean, I still do get very useful stuff from state, agency FOIA requests sometimes, whether that's by accident, or folks who don't know that they shouldn't put things in an email, or are disgruntled and intentionally put things in emails as a result. So yeah, I'd still rather see the law expanded, even if people figure out ways to get around it.
I mean, the problem is that the law has to be expanded by the people who would be negatively affected by expanding it, which in Arizona would never fly. I mean, I'm never going to get over it though. I'm so incredulous. How is that possibly the law? Like, I can't even imagine like saying, oh yeah, every other reporter in Arizona has to sit on the floor and drink tea, but I get to sit on the high chair and drink out of the, the coffee pot. How on earth could that possibly be allowed? Like, they can't give themselves raises, for example, that has to go to the voters, but they can exempt themselves from public records law. It's just, I just don't get it. Anyway, I don't think it's going to change here anytime soon. That's what I'm trying to say.
I kind of want to jump in with a question here, thinking, because we've talked a lot about open records and some of the other ways in which, kind of transparency can happen. I'd like to ask about whistleblowing. Do you notice any trends in whistleblowing in your state, or difficulty in getting government employees to provide tips or speak out on wrongdoing? Any trends one way or another worth noting?
I don't know if this is a trend per se. We're kind of opposite of Jonathan, that we have less Statehouse reporters, and we lost 4 right before the session in January. So we're going the opposite way. But I get a lot of Twitter DMs, a decent amount, that say, I didn't know who to call. We don't have a local paper. We don't have a Statehouse reporter. I don't know my representative. I think, so I don't know if that's a trend, but that's certainly something that wasn't happening in my career even 5 years ago. So at least in West Virginia, I've seen a lot more. I did not know if this is even the right person to send this to. I just don't know anyone else, because we don't have a newsroom in my county even.
And these are state employees who see something?
Sometimes it's county employees, sometimes it's state employees, sometimes it's, I'm in the child welfare world a lot. Sometimes it's a foster parent that just doesn't know who else to call, but definitely a lot of them cite, we don't have a local paper anymore, so I'm not sure who to talk to about this.
The Twitter DM whistleblower tip line. That's fascinating. Camryn?
We have 2 publications that come out daily: the Ledge Report, which comes out every day of session, and the Yellow Sheet, which just comes out every day, Monday through Friday, that is. And for those 2 publications, we do these little tiny news items, like a couple hundred words. And they're sort of gossipy, quippy, tip sheet stuff. And for those, we get to use what we call railbirds, which are anonymous sources, often politicos, but nameless, which we don't do for the paper, which is more traditional. But that's actually a really good tool. I think that the Cap Times gets to use that other papers don't. So people know that they're going to be protected, and they come to us and they give us little tidbits of information. It's usually not Watergate level, but little things that, hey, you might want to check on this such and such. And then we can say that a railbird passed it along. But, obviously we check it ourselves. I don't think that a lot of papers get to do that, and it's a useful tool. Those often develop into larger stories.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think to the extent I've had whistleblowers come to me on their own, it's been typically folks who have recently left state government and are not still inside of it. I think there is a general fear of retaliation still, and in fact, during the pandemic, there was even a push by the administration to try and prevent state employees from speaking directly with legislators, that legislators would have to go through higher ups at a department rather than talk directly to, run-of-the-mill state employees, which was very controversial and prompted a fight between the administration and lawmakers. But yeah, I get the sense that there's general wariness about, most state employees speaking to reporters directly, and that's unfortunate.
Thank you. And then I kind of want to go back to what you were kind of talking about earlier with local journalism and talking about, the crazy things at city councils or in counties. I mean, we have a couple of interesting things happening on a county level, certainly across Michigan right now. Could you describe the connection between state and local journalism in your states? Does local journalism coverage act as maybe almost a precursor to action or coverage at the state capitol? Just kind of trying to explain sort of the process, the life cycle here of information and how it gets to the state level.
Sure, yeah, it certainly can. I mean, for instance, you might recall this from a couple of years ago, local governments started just discussing the idea of banning plastic bags at grocery stores. And the state legislature stepped in and passed a law banning plastic bag bans. So certainly, sometimes the legislature responds to what's happening at a local level. As far as, my work as a reporter, I mean, the more local government reporting there is, the better for me, because then I can pick up on trends without having to watch every local government, meeting in the state, which would be impossible. So for instance, just this week, my colleague reported on, we've got some firearm safety and gun control legislation moving through the legislature here. 43 counties in Michigan have adopted resolutions declaring themselves sanctuary counties or otherwise strong adherence of the Second Amendment in ways that, are signaling they might not enforce stricter gun laws if they passed. We know that because, thankfully, organizers have been pretty vocal about it, so we knew, but also, there have been some local reporters who were at those meetings when those things were discussed. And, you see enough of those stories at the local level as a state government reporter, you think, oh, wow, there's really something going on here that has implications for the state as a whole. And, sometimes you can get that through government reports, not necessarily being at the meeting. For instance, like with the federal stimulus money, ARPA funds, Congress did require a fair amount of documentation on how local governments use those dollars, but also the state prepared reports on who accepted them. I mean, there were like a couple dozen local governments that said no thanks to
Turn it down.
free money, essentially. I mean, obviously that's taxpayer money, but they have taxpayers in their communities too. But they were so opposed to the idea of federal stimulus funding that they simply rejected the dollars. And, again, that's the sort of thing that often will bubble up from the local level that you can pick up and then turn into a statewide story, a trend story, if you will.
Camryn?
Yeah, I would say also when it comes to elections, people who end up in the state legislature, they often started off at being a community organizer or even maybe on their district school board or city council or something, and then they become state lawmakers. A lot of the time, that's not where they stop. They're trying to up to DC. So sometimes a colorful character at the local level becomes relevant to me in the Senate because they're gunning for that Senate seat if and when it becomes possible for them to get a hold of it. So also, not just from a policy standpoint, but from a career standpoint.
Amelia?
I feel like a broken record, but we have so little local reporting here that I kind of have the opposite experience, that we often learn about local news from lawmakers, like on the floor. They'll be like, oh, last week in our county, 4 kids died in a CPS case gone wrong. It's like nobody even heard about that. There's no paper there to cover that. That's not always true, but it is a lot of times that we are finding out things in the Statehouse, Google, there's no news story been written about it. So I think we're kind of seeing the opposite here, but I will say one area that I've seen local coverage has made a huge impact is we're in a jails crisis here, right? Like understaffed jails. We've had a lot of deaths in our jails. And, there's just one reporter who is a do-it-all reporter, but she's really stayed focused on the jails beat. And that's made a huge difference in bringing that story to lawmakers. I mean, she's been writing about it for 4 years. when nobody was caring about it, and now it's a huge deal. But yeah, it's kind of interesting hearing y'all, because I feel like we have the opposite here, where we're just like, man, I didn't even know that was going on in so-and-so's community, and we're hearing a lawmaker bring it to our attention.
Would you mind sharing a little bit about child welfare services or foster care and just different ways those stories were gathered all across the state? Because I know you've really prioritized coverage there. And I'm thinking with what you're saying, how?
Like, how did I gather those stories? Well, really, I started covering child welfare because our state was sued by an out-of-state nonprofit and some attorneys here in West Virginia. Basically, this huge lawsuit just said you violated the constitutional rights of every child in foster care, all 7,000 kids. And so I just read the lawsuit, and like every paragraph was like more shocking than the last. I was like, well, what? I didn't even know we did this. So from there, I just really started trying to connect with foster parents. And I think, like Jonathan said, state employees have a hesitancy to talk to us. Well, CPS workers, most of them work for the state. Foster parents need the state to give, to give them a child, right? And money for that child. So they were really hesitant. So it took a lot of time to even find one kid to feature in our story who had been abused in the system. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it just takes time. I mean, at one point I had a Gmail account that was just for people to send in foster care tips, just trying to connect with people. And I would just tweet it out constantly. But yeah, it wasn't easy. But I think it's really important. And even though I'm, this is like the thing I like to write about, and I'm really hopefully entrenched in, I still find out things in committee meetings all the time that I didn't even know had happened, because it's just such a closed off part of government to us as reporters.
And that's what I'm thinking so much about, is just this process of how lawmakers find out about something like this is happening, and then how they leverage the power of their office to find facts, how they hold a hearing, how they decide to put a report together, how they get the information and the facts they need to be able to figure out, okay, does there need to be some sort of a regulation change here? Does there need to be some change in law? What are our next steps? And, the media is such an essential role in that process of bringing these sorts of, kind of ugly facts, ugly truths to light, but things that need to absolutely be known about, where, again, like we just talked about at the very beginning, those that have the most to lose when government doesn't do its job have the least ability to say anything about it. And that's really kind of where that gap can be filled by stronger local journalism. Speaking of stronger journalism, or maybe just different journalism, I'm going to ask one more question and pass it back over to Adam. I just have to ask about it. News is changing. My brother is younger than me. My brother is in his early 20s. Any news he sends my way is from TikTok. It's all 30 seconds of dances of these things happen at the Capitol today. Here's the bill that was passed and the hearing that we did, kind of stuff. Those types of shorter news pieces or tweets, how does that change state capitol coverage, especially if it's anything related to an oversight context? How does that change, sort of from the longer form, more traditional media? Are there certain types of topics or stories that are prioritized with that type of a format? Does it have more of an impact with lawmakers paying attention to things more than others? Media is changing and news is changing. I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that. I can do another TikTok dance if you really need me to, just to add more context.
I feel like we all cringed when you said that.
Yeah, sorry. I have a couple lawmakers on TikTok right now, and it's
painful.
It's not for me. And I am in my early 20s, but I think, one thing to say about news changing is I think people still are definitely consuming media. It's just not the way that they used to. And I think with social media and the way that we do news, you have to assume, unfortunately, that people don't have maybe the longest time span, and maybe they're just looking at the first graph or even the headline, which sucks when you wrote a 2,000-word article on something that's really complicated. But focusing on the news at the top and utilizing social media to the best of your ability. I mean, I don't tweet every single thing that happens in every single committee because everyone would hate me. But I'll do, like 3 important tweets in succession on like an important discussion that's happening, and people will share that on Twitter. And sometimes, honestly, I think more people view that than the news story I write about it that afternoon. So it's not my favorite thing, but it is a reality. And I think we should be adapting, at least to the best of our ability.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm not on TikTok, so I haven't gone there. I believe though that we got to reach people where they are, right? And if folks are on TikTok, it makes sense for news organizations to be there. Maybe not me as the reporter, but our social media person, and hopefully can use that as a vehicle to steer people towards the deeper reporting that they might find on other channels. But yeah, you gotta be where people are for sure. And if everybody's getting their news from TikTok, I assume we'll see more news channels, news organizations having a more prominent role on TikTok. I mean, obviously, the last 10 years, Facebook really changed the way news organizations operate. Twitter to some extent, although I think Twitter is, it's not like Twitter does not drive traffic to your actual story in the way that Facebook traditionally has done. People are much less likely to click on a link through Twitter than they are on Facebook, according to all the metrics I've seen over my years of reporting. So, Twitter, I think, is more of a quick hit, different form of communication, not necessarily a way to promote deeper reporting. And maybe TikTok won't be either, but I certainly like the Washington Post TikTok guy is very funny. I've seen his TikToks on Twitter. And I get it. I mean, it's entertaining, it's captivating. And of course, we all want to, we're not entertainers, but I think we all understand that that's a way to lure readers in to our coverage. So, yeah. I just, I'm old enough that I'll probably not have to be the person that does that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Amelia?
If I could answer it in a slightly different way, one thing I saw that happened this session, we just wrapped up our 60-day session a couple weeks ago. We had some I'll call them like social media journalists who were breaking news on TikTok and Twitter. And that's great. There's a place for that. But they were also activists. And Camryn made the great point earlier that we are not activists, we're journalists. So working in a pretty anti-media state, we were talking in the press room, it made our jobs harder. Because when we were also trying to write about those bills, they didn't, it's like, I don't want to diminish the role of like what they're doing on Twitter, but it's not this type of journalism, right? And so that was kind of an unintended consequence that I hadn't seen until this session, of just kind of the double whammy of like so few people in the press corps and then more people on Twitter, and kind of blurring that line between journalist and activist. And they are filling a need. They're getting news out there, but it can be, it still leaves a hole for investigative journalism, right? And I'm not sure how those will merge, if that makes sense at all.
No, it really does.
So I think as we start to wrap up the questions and get ready for a bit of Q&A, I want to return to this area that I think is a strength of the State Oversight Academy and the Levin Center, which is that it is like a resource for expertise for lawmakers, for academics. And I think in a way, my question is for you is, how about journalists? So how do you and where do you go for expertise on the operations of state government? You all are, from where I'm sitting, the experts. You're there, you're in the halls, you understand the processes, procedures, the personalities better than probably anyone. So if there's something that comes up that you need to know, how does this work? Where do you go?
A lot of places. I think I mentioned earlier, I think it's complete hubris for me to think that I know everything about every topic that comes through the Senate. And I've also only been here for a few years. Luckily, I have colleagues who have been here longer, who have institutional knowledge. So there's other reporters I go to, my editor, for background, for context, and then, consultants and attorneys and professors who cover these things, who have been here for a while. Those are really good sources, just to chat, but also for quotes. especially when it's a complicated tax issue, for example. Finance was not my strong suit in college, but I have to know about it now. Luckily, there are a lot of smart, reliable people here. Ideally nonpartisan, but sometimes partisan with a grain of salt. You talk to someone about their position, what they think because of their party, but you take that into account when you're talking to them. And that's been extremely helpful for me. Sources upon sources.
Yeah, people have a lot of strong opinions on term limits one way or another, but one, I guess, helpful byproduct for reporters is that there are a lot of former state lawmakers who are still around because of the revolving door in Lansing. Maybe now they work in the lobbying corps or for an association or something like that. But there are a lot, or a think tank, but there are like just a lot of former lawmakers who have been through the processes or the policies who are around and available generally for me to use as a resource. That said, certainly researchers, political scientists, I will talk to as well, oftentimes in the context of a story, but not always. Reporters as well, fellow reporters who have been through this, who have covered, like right now in Michigan, there's an income tax debate, but it all hinges on a 2015 law. So like eight years ago. Luckily, I was actually around then. I started covering the legislature shortly before that. So I have some institutional knowledge of it. But not everyone does. And I was in that position when I first started, and you lean on anybody you can. Again, one helpful thing with term limits is we got a lot of those resources here.
And maybe one last question on this. So if that question is, who do you go to for expertise or for information? Do you sometimes get a piece of information or something that may or may not lead to a story that you think this is really important? Let me share this with other people, be it academics or think tanks or politicians. I haven't thought that through. But I guess what I thought of with this question was, suppose you had access to some big leak of material. Would you take that to some outside person? If so, who? For an extra set of eyeballs, or for some extra, work going through it or thinking about it, etc.
I could see myself theoretically. I have not taken leaked documents to experts, but I have taken, documents I've gotten from FOIA, like contracts, et cetera, to attorneys or legal experts, scholars who might be able to walk me through what the language means. Again, oftentimes I end up quoting those people, but not always. But certainly, I wouldn't shy away from it. Obviously, with a leak, you got to be careful who you bring it to, because you don't want them leaking it again to somebody else. If it's something you're, hoping to have an exclusive on. But yeah, I think, we all know as reporters, especially policy and political reporters, you're basically like having to learn something new every day or every week, depending on the bill you're covering. And I know now how to read legislation pretty well. I don't know all the nuances of policy. So yeah, of course, I've got to talk to experts who know better than I do on a very regular basis.
Oh, I'll just throw in as a pitch for any academics. I know we have at least one or two on the call. We would love to hear what you think the interesting issues are, or the problems in the political process. Amelia has talked repeatedly about just how bad the local news environment is in West Virginia. I'm sure there are academics who would, think about looking into that and how it has affected things like the accountability of local elected officials or state agencies at the local level, et cetera. So you are on the ground and seeing things that we don't know about, and we would love to know what you think. So a pitch to get in touch with your friendly local political scientist. Ben, do you have any more questions before we go to Q&A?
I'm going to kick it off by going over to Q&A. So I'm looking at one of the first questions asked here from Professor Marjorie Shawbaugh-Thompson. And this is a question that was building on Camryn's comments about needing sources of information yourselves. To what extent do you rely on reports from an Auditor General's office or Inspector General reports?
Oh yeah, I'll jump in. I was doing this yesterday, which is why it's interesting. We have an issue here. One of our state agencies, the School for the Blind and Deaf, is facing a shorter continuation period. And the school is upset because they had a clean audit recently from our Auditor General's office, which is a nonpartisan office that audits state agencies. And so they're like, why are we being punished? We haven't done anything wrong. And it's a whole thing. Anyway, it's actually a really fun story. But yes, I definitely read the Auditor General's most recent report and the one before that, because the one before that was more damning than the most recent one in 2022. So that sort of adds into the narrative in a way that I think is important, which is that actually the school was having more problems 15 years ago. So why are we shortening the continuation now when the most recent report said the school is actually doing pretty well? You know, the Auditor General is a good resource, and they don't really like to talk to me, the press, because they don't want to share their opinions on things. They don't want to be the shocking quote, but they are great for background, and those reports are super helpful for keeping track of state agencies.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I try and at least glance at every report from the Michigan Auditor General's office and make a, try and, I mean, yeah, I write stories on those, fairly regularly. A lot of them are just like financial audits and stuff like that aren't particularly newsworthy, but certainly, there have been a lot of newsworthy ones. During COVID, there were Auditor General reports that were really interesting. Ways the state has spent money on the Flint water crisis were subject to audits. Problems with our child welfare system have been flagged by state auditors as well. So yeah, those are a great resource. I mean, I'm glad they exist. Too, though, as Camryn said, the Auditor Generals are usually auditors are usually not super media friendly. Like, they kind of do their job behind the scenes and they don't want to be in the spotlight necessarily. I have found it somewhat helpful that at least for a while, the Auditor General here was using Twitter to say when they were starting an audit, so you at least knew it was happening. You could like sort of prepare for it to come out. It might be months later, but at least had some sort of understanding of what they might be looking at. Here, the auditor will pick their own reviews, but also lawmakers can request certain audit investigations as well. And sometimes the lawmakers will let you know that they've requested that, so it's coming as well. But yeah, they're generally the reports are a great resource. If a little dry sometimes, the reports themselves, it might contain very interesting findings, but written in sort of a way that might make an accountant fall asleep.
Thanks. Amelia?
He said a lot of what I was going to say, but I'll just add that I probably my most successful FOIAs come from the auditor's office, because pretty much anything in state government goes through them. So even covering child welfare, you would not think that's an auditor's section, as Jonathan said, but they audit certain parts of it. And every time the health department spends money on these children, it goes through the auditor's office. And so I've even had to think through, and have been lucky to work with journalists who are more experienced than me, and thinking, okay, if I can't get it from the health department, can I get it from the auditor? Did they spend money anytime? And that's been kind of something I didn't foresee in my career, but I work with them a lot. And our auditor's running for governor, so he loves to talk to the media, but that's just here.
Thanks.
Ben, I'm going to jump in on the next two questions because Professor Shawbaugh-Thompson corrected me on an issue about Michigan term limits, showing that actually party discipline increased in Michigan after term limits were instituted. Just answered that. And then her prior question, what about reporters listening to taped hearings rather than attending in person? If we're talking about what effect, and Jonathan mentioned this a bit earlier, your presence, just mere presence has on the behavior of elected officials. I've long wanted to do this project. So please, if any reporters, you three or anyone else is interested, let me know, where we just randomized which committee hearing you went to, or which local town hall by an elected official you went to versus other, and then just looked at the behavior of the people in those hearings. Do they talk differently? Do they showboat more when you are or aren't there? I think it'd be a great project to measure this. So the question that Professor Sarbaugh-Thompson asked is how you think about taped hearings versus going live to try to maybe deal with these potential observer effects.
Well, I'm usually not experimenting on their behavior when I'm around or not around. I go for specific reasons. So on an average day, Monday through Thursday, the legislature will have morning committee meetings, floor session, and then afternoon committee meetings. That's not always the case, but often the case. I'll often have like 2 meetings going on at the same time. So like yesterday, education and military affairs both started at 2 p.m. in the Senate. And I went to education because the School of Blind and Deaf situation, which is complicated and I can't get into it here, was going on in education. So I decided to go to that in person. There are some benefits to going in person, which is 1, I took the camera, I got live photos. 2, people in public testimony are there, I can grab them in person. 3, the lawmakers are there, I can catch them in person in the hallway. And, you know, I think that's all really valuable. Some lawmakers I can only catch in the hallway, like they won't respond to a text. So me jumping on them in the hall is like my best bet for getting a comment. But then I'll watch military affairs, the hearing that I missed yesterday later on, because I can't be in 2 places at once. And because the bill's there, not that they're not important, but you know, that wasn't the article I was writing. So usually that's what influences where I am at any given time. It's like which laws I'm tracking for that week. But yeah, it increases the showboating.
I forgot to say hello to Professor Sarbaugh-Thompson. She is one of those experts I've spoken to on occasion with her research into term limits specifically. So appreciate that. Yeah, I think it would be an interesting experiment. I'm not sure my editor would want me going to random committee hearings. I don't know if that'd be the greatest use of my time, but if you could find somebody else to do it, I would read that research. But yeah, as far as showing in person to committee hearings, I think it's important. I think you got to do it as a reporter whenever you can. As I mentioned, sometimes these hearings, especially ones on controversial issues, can have sort of a scripted feeling. And if you're only, reporting on what is said via a video feed, you're often only getting the talking points. Being there in person is the opportunity to ask difficult follow-up questions, to challenge assumptions or statements that lawmakers made. And you can't do that watching a stream. I mean, that said, sometimes the reality of the job is that you have to, like Camryn said, can't be 2 places at once all the time, and on busy legislative days, that's often a reality. And during the pandemic, I will admit, like early in the pandemic, especially for the first year or so, I mostly followed things via video feeds, and it's not the same. It's not as good of reporting. It's not as deep of reporting. And like I said, lawmakers are able to escape scrutiny more if nobody shows up to those hearings to ask them real questions afterwards. So yeah, always try and be there in person if I can be.
I just wanted to add one more thing. There's a reason that I'm never going to write about this, the way that they change their behavior if I'm in the room, because I can't definitively say that ever. I can't infer, so-and-so said this sentence because I was in the room. Like I can't ever be positive of that and make that claim. Also, I don't think that if I went to Senator so-and-so that he would say, oh yeah, that whole speech was just because I knew the media was in the room. Like I assume they wouldn't say that. So I think, it's just just a hunch.
See, that's what makes it so interesting. And you can also see why this is a project I would love to do and have not done, because yes, it's hard to get people to randomize what they're doing. Although I'll point out, Camryn, next time you got 2 meetings, if you're equally interested, flip a coin. And then if we do that a couple hundred times, then we can have a nice study. Next question is about bipartisan fact-finding committee reviews. Is it your experience that state capitol media corps editors and readers find coverage of systemic legislative oversight to be newsworthy, or is it, not so headline grabbing?
Can you define systemic oversight for us non-academics?
I didn't ask this question.
Okay. Oversight hearings, I'll say, at the state capitol are often newsworthy, simply because they generally, dive into controversial topics, right? In the last session, we had a Republican-led legislature and a Democratic-led Democratic administration, Democratic governor. So that was, often a forum for very probing hearings. Again, sometimes seemingly scripted, as I mentioned, but certainly generally newsworthy. They had the power to call, department heads in to testify and things of that nature. That said, from a bigger picture view, I know some lawmakers here have talked about the idea of creating more of a permanent bipartisan oversight committee that, just as an observer, I think might be a more effective form of oversight, because otherwise you've got things that are just cyclical, right? Like if Democrats control the legislature, they're probably not going to spend a lot of time holding really hard-hitting oversight hearings on the Democratic governor, and vice versa. So the idea of establishing more of a bipartisan committee, I think, sounds really interesting. I don't know. I guess I don't know how effective it would be and what other states have done. You guys probably know better than I do if that's an idea that's been tested in other states and proven effective. But it has some appeal, just because I think you'd get a more stable form of oversight, perhaps, over the long term with that sort of a system.
Yeah, and there's a good number of states that have approached this, doing joint committees, doing bipartisan committees, even committees of equal partisan membership, and they will prioritize certain oversight topics, and will, the way the resolution last term was set up, where it would be certain topics, certain priorities that would be then shown to the auditor general to be able to run studies and get information. And I mean, what a strong signal from a legislature, even a bipartisan group of people saying, hey, we just need more facts about child welfare services or about corrections and prison operations, whatever the issue might be. That's really how you kind of can get facts that everyone can kind of look at and give credit and give credence to, and legislators are uniquely positioned to be able to do that, but trying to empower them to be able to believe they can is a really big process of what the SOA is going to be trying to do. Camryn, I saw your hand was up.
I don't think that in Arizona we have this sort of bipartisan oversight committee that you're asking about, so it's not totally comparable. We do have an ombudsman office that people can complain about state agencies to, and that person comes and talks. And we have agency heads who come and talk in our existing committees, but I don't think we have quite the same process. We also, for the first time in a while, have a Republican legislature and a Democrat governor, when it was all Republicans before. So that's going kind of poorly, but yeah, there's definitely some challenging of Democrat policies by Republicans and Republican policies by Democrats, and they're not really pretending to be friends. So we have that going on.
Are there any independent commissions, or these blue ribbon commissions? You see them in Congress a good bit. Are there any of those at the state level? Are they real fact-finding and research committees in any way? Do they provide interesting or useful information, or is this something that A, only goes on in Congress, and B, is mostly a way of shunting off responsibility for problems onto an organization that has no actual power?
I mean, there's us and we have the Auditor General, but no, I'm not sure we have that same thing that you're talking about on the congressional level.
Yeah, I don't, I mean, we have certainly commissions, and committees, and sometimes those have been interesting and effective from a policy standpoint. Like we've seen some bipartisan work emerge on criminal justice reform, for instance, as a result of bipartisan commissions, often, in some cases funded by like national groups in some capacity that help organize these things and bring people together. So there's been a handful of topics, I think, where that's worked, but they're not permanent structures. And generally all they could do then is recommend legislation, and it's up to then partisan lawmakers to decide whether they want to move forward or not. I brought up the criminal justice reform because that is one area where we have seen a lot of bipartisan cooperation in Michigan in recent years. Some of it, based on recommendations from commissions that were established to sort of take deep dives into issues that lawmakers might not have enough time to do so on their own.
Well, there's also an example in North Carolina. You have a joint commission on government operations, and they actually have that as a constitutional joint commission that is comprised of a bipartisan group of lawmakers. It's not equal partisan membership, but it is a bipartisan group from the House and the Senate, and they can prioritize certain topics, things like the disaster mitigation, hurricane response is one of the things they've chosen, because again, like those sorts of things, a hurricane doesn't really care if you're Democratic or Republican. So they were finding ways to be able to find facts on how to be able to respond when those sorts of disasters strike their state.
So the next question in the chat is about legislators and where they're getting their information. Is there any way to find out when the legislator says, I spoke to so-and-so in my district and they have this problem? Are they telling the truth? And can you figure out, you ever track down who so-and-so is?
I try with FOIA, but it doesn't always work out.
Could you tell me more?
I mean, sometimes, well, yeah, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, they'll say somebody from my district contacted me and said this is a problem and so we need to legislate it. And it could be just something so that affects one person, but now we're doing the sweeping bill. Like we had one about sports transfers this year, which interestingly was the longest debate of the whole session, high school sports, but that's another story. But you try to FOIA and find out, did this person actually contact you? Now, granted, I do think that most of the contact goes on Facebook, which is not going to come up in a FOIA, but I think it's worth looking at their email. And typically searching our FOIA laws are different in West Virginia. We can FOIA for government emails, but typically what you're going to find is surprisingly who has contacted someone over a bill they want passed. So I think you might go into it looking for one thing. You might be, oh, I didn't realize the special interest group had been contacting a lawmaker pushing for some legislation.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the circumstance. There's certainly been some bills where lawmakers feel passionately about an issue and and I ask them, who have you talked to about this? Can you connect me with people impacted by it? And they're able to. I mean, that certainly happens. There are other times where, lawmakers say, all my constituents are telling me to do this. And then, you see that their bill is like a model legislation that's been drafted in every state in the country. So Michigan, again, our lawmakers are exempt from FOIA, so we're not able to see necessarily where ideas for bills or the actual language originates. And in fact, some of the discussion about expanding Michigan's open records law in Michigan has still largely focused around the idea of exempting constituent communications with lawmakers to try and keep those more of a personal level and, not discourage members of the public from sharing personal stories or details with lawmakers if they're seeking solutions for issues they're facing.
Well, Jonathan, I just remember when I was working in the Michigan legislature and I was in a member office, and I mean, we were a first resort or a very, very last resort for some, just devastating stories, extremely personal ones too. Things that really you don't need to have on the front of bridge. I'm sorry.
Sure.
But with that being said, I do think that a conversation on increasing transparency needs to be had, of course.
So maybe we'll take the next two questions together. Do you have a favorite committee to cover based on access, personal interests, et cetera? Or what do you consider the biggest story of your career? And can you tell us a little bit about how it was to investigate and report that? Feel free to take up either or both of those. I said I'd call on people. Oh.
Talking about oversight, I'll share a story about some of my reporting that I did. It was a difficult topic, but you know, you folks have probably heard something about the Flint water crisis in Michigan. It was something that I'll admit I didn't jump on early enough. Some local reporters did in Flint, and the ACLU actually had their own, you know, it's advocacy group, but they had a reporter who was on that story early as well. But we did, I was working for the Detroit News at the time. And as I mentioned, the governor's office is exempt from FOIA here. But there were a lot of questions about what the governor's office knew and when it knew it. And a colleague of mine, Chad Levin, actually convinced the governor's office to voluntarily release their emails. I think we got like 10,000 of them. It was an incredible amount. We got them a few days early before any other news organization. And we put together a team of reporters in the Detroit News headquarters. I think there were like 10 people, just going through those, printing off interesting ones, putting them in piles, creating impromptu cataloging systems to try and, you know, organize things by topic. And, you know, we did produce some reporting I'm very proud of. Chad and I both had front page stories. Other reporters worked on them, but we were the lead authors on 2 front page stories the very next day. You know, gave us, for Michigan anyways, a rare glimpse into what actually happens sort of behind the curtain, or at least by email in the governor's office. You know, and it was impactful reporting too, showing some levels of you know, revealing some you know, poor decisions and lack of follow through by both state and federal regulators who could have stepped in and done things earlier there. And that's in you know, to basically limit exposure to poison water.
Amelia or Camryn. Camryn, we are going over the next 2 questions in the Q&A. What would you consider the biggest story of your career, or do you have a favorite committee to cover?
Favorite committee to cover is Senate Finance. It's wild in there. It's just kind of interesting to see all the things that come before them. It's probably the most powerful committee before things hit the Senate floor. And so if it's risen to that committee, that means it's probably going to make it. And in our legislature, probably means it's going to get passed. So I think Senate Finance is a good place where they hash out bills before they get on the floor. So I enjoy covering that. And I learned so much, right? Because it's like finance as a reporter, you don't think you're going to write about numbers, right, Camryn? I'm with you on that. But it's like, it comes up all the time. So I enjoy that. I don't know if I'd say, I'll just say favorite. I mean, I really enjoyed the foster care story that we did. And the only other thing I'll add to, because I already talked about it, I went into that story thinking it was a story about one home in Ohio that we sent kids to who were being sexually abused and physically abused at this home. So for background, we don't have enough foster homes in West Virginia. So we ship several hundred kids out of state every year to group homes, essentially. And as I started filing FOIAs, I thought the story turned into, oh, social workers aren't visiting the kids once a month like they're supposed to. And then I kept digging and digging. And what the story ended up being all through FOIA was our health department knew they were sending kids to homes with abuse. In fact, they had flagged the abuse on their own inspections and didn't immediately pull the kids out of it. And that story took like 10 months to report. I also was pregnant almost the entire length of it. So it's like I published a story and gave birth a week later. So to me, it was just, I went on this journey of just thinking the story was one thing and was going to be a 1 week story. And it turned into like a 10-month investigation of a big, deep problem that most of our lawmakers didn't know was even happening. So now there's, it's just kind of interesting. Now I go to the Capitol and people are asking me to help them understand more about the situation, right? It wasn't on any of our radar 2 years ago. So anyway, I think for me, that was just a really eye-opening experience of going into it thinking it's going to be one story and finding a much deeper story on the other side of it.
And there's a pattern there. I mean, that's the exact same story with Flint Water. There's a gap of just the knowledge, information, and the facts that are put in front of the legislature, and just how, by leveraging the power of their office, they could find this out. They could find this information. And that's why it's so important for journalists, for people like that ACLU reporter, to talk about the Flint Water, to have reporters like all of you sound the alarm to legislatures to be able to try to find how to have government programs and services operate better, or operate at all, in the case of the profound failure of the Flint Water crisis.
Yeah, my favorite committee to cover this year, it's the Director Nominations Committee, the DINO for short. This is a new committee that Republicans created this year, which specifically is made to vet the Democrat governor's nominees for various offices. So they really put these people through the ringer, and it's obviously fun for us to cover. And every single one has had a lot of news coverage, not just me. I think the last article I wrote about it was that the two nominees went through easily, and that was a headline because normally that's not the case. And in terms of my favorite stories to cover, that's really hard. It's really hard to pick one. I think my favorite articles so far have been things that you wouldn't find out otherwise, like writing about the DINO committee. Everyone would know that. Everyone would know what happens, but writing about things like, I wrote about some of our lawmakers getting subpoenaed by the FBI. That also turned into a bigger story as more subpoenas came in. It was tied to January 6th that involved our work in the audit. And election denial is very common here in Arizona. That's something that played into the 2022 election. It's carried over from the 2020 election. And I was really proud of that one in particular, I think, because I was the first one to report on it. And I fancy that maybe it wouldn't have gotten written if I hadn't been there in the first place. So that's always gratifying.
Thank you, Camryn. Well, and thank you, everybody. I actually just noticed the clock. We're 2 minutes after. So I want to say thanks to everybody for joining the conversation. I hope you can be with us all next month for we're doing a panel on corrections oversight, and more details will be shared on our social media channels and in our newsletter. And if you found the conversation to be interesting, please follow the Levin Center on social media and subscribe to our newsletter for more engaging content on state legislative oversight. And all of this information, you can find it at stateoversight.org. And thanks again for being part of our State Oversight Academy launch. Thanks, everybody.